Let's take the last part first about how it differs from humanitarian intervention. The so-called challenge of humanitarian intervention was raised by Secretary General Kofi Annan in the wake of significant events in 1999, particularly in Kosovo and then also, of course, in our own region in East Timor. The historical baggage of humanitarian intervention is very unfortunate for most developing countries, and I think it's too strong to be sustained for a new consensus to emerge amongst developing countries, particularly in Asia, but not only limited in Asia. And therefore, Mr. Annan challenged the international community to come up with a new consensus which would reconcile the imperative to come to the assistance of victims in large numbers at risk of massacres and other atrocity crimes, and the sustaining and enduring commitment to state sovereignty as the bedrock principle of world order. The Canadian government responded to that and brought together an international commission on intervention and state sovereignty, of which I had a privilege to be a member. And we did, I think, successfully reconcile the tension with our innovative formulation of the responsibility to protect. So we said it's not states that have rights, whether it is sovereignty or whether it is intervention. Rights belong to people. States have duties, whether it is a national state in terms of protecting its people and others resident on its territory, or rights that the international community has when a state is either unable to, unwilling to, or is itself the perpetrator of atrocities. And that formula was tightened and endorsed unanimously in 2005. Just under 4 years after we presented our report to Mr. Annan in December 2001. Since 2005, the General Assembly has had 3 annual debates on that, and each year the consensus has been reaffirmed, and the meaning and content of responsibility to protect, I think, has been clarified and is now better understood. So there is a globally endorsed norm. The principle, I think, has now graduated to constitute a global norm, and we've seen its first application in Libya. In the case of Libya, I think it was a successful but controversial application of the norm, and therefore the differences and controversies remain, and they need to be confronted and addressed so that, particularly in this region, the comfort level is increased. The basic proposition is that in today's world, we have to find a balance between absolute non-interference and absolute institutionalized indifference, as the Africans call it, because the choice is not whether to intervene, but the circumstances and conditions in which interventions will take place. The reality is, historically, interventions took place long before R2P was promulgated as a norm, and interventions are not guaranteed even with R2P. What responsibility to protect does is to provide a better basis and some guidance on which to intervene. Is it going to be multilateral or unilateral? Is it going to be rules-based or ad hoc? Is it going to be deeply divisive again, or will it be based on consensus? And therefore it is, I think, to the advantage and interests of all parties concerned if we agree on the norm and agree on some principles in advance that will guide this. And that will make it more difficult for the major powers to interfere when they shouldn't, and it will make it more difficult for them to abstain from collective help when they should. It will also, from their point of view, ensure that the transaction and compliance costs are lower rather than higher when they do undertake military interventions collectively on behalf of the regional or international community, and it will ensure that the results of that intervention are better, seek to address and help the victims, and are therefore more durable. So it's a convergence of interests as traditionally defined and values as articulated by the global community. I'm glad you asked that question, because I think, to my mind, that is probably the single most important lesson that comes out of Libya. What we saw was the power of responsibility to protect as a norm. The Arab League, not unlike ASEAN, was instinctively suspicious about any outside international military intervention against the consent of a member state. But when faced with a crisis, a genuine humanitarian crisis unfolding in Libya in the early part of this year, by middle of March, February, March, let's say, it's the language of responsibility to protect that they found most expedient in raising the issue both regionally and globally, and asking for the United Nations Security Council to declare a no-fly zone, which then would be enforced by NATO, because the Arab League didn't have the capacity, NATO has the capacity. So it's a very useful indication of this three-way partnership. The regional organization concerned acts as a regional gatekeeper of a global norm. It is articulated in a form of a binding resolution by the Security Council, but the implementation is left to another regional organization that actually has the military capacity to do so. And therefore, faced with a similar situation in Southeast Asia, I think it is highly likely that ASEAN would also find itself utilizing the power of this new norm and its normative language to mobilize both regional support and global support in order to resolve the issue. By the same token, we know in Libya the United States was extremely reluctant to get involved after the difficulties it has had, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, but even more generally, the fatigue and the disenchantment with using military force for other purposes. But it was unable to resist that call led by the Arabs and led by Britain and France, again because of the mobilizing power of responsibility to protect as a new global norm. At the same time, finally, what we see in Libya is that because the Security Council Resolution 1973 was couched to implement the responsibility to protect norm, it underlined some of the limitations that are inherent in responsibility to protect as distinct from the old and discredited humanitarian intervention norm, namely enforce a no-fly zone, enforce no-drive zone, but explicitly in the resolution no foreign occupation forces were to be permitted as a ground force in Libya. So I think we see both the power and the limitations, and therefore, although I think it is in the short term still controversial, as the implications and ramifications are internalized by the international community and the regional actors, I think the comfort level will grow. And so I would hope that this will be taken up by analysts and commentators and put on the policy agenda, and ASEAN in turn will articulate in advance some of the guiding principles, what we had called in our report the precautionary principles, what the high-level panel turned into the legitimacy criteria, which were endorsed by Kofi Annan in his own In Larger Freedom. I think that should be an urgent priority for ASEAN, because it is much better to articulate these principles and criteria well in advance rather than in the middle of a crisis. We will assuredly face a crisis in our own region. We should be prepared for it normatively, organizationally, and also operationally. With UNESCO, of course, it's a repeat of a cycle. The United States did withdraw from UNESCO for several years and then rejoined, and now it has withdrawn its funding. UNESCO survived before, it will survive again. What is worrying about this is the implications of a unilateral action, because of course if that sets a precedent, then any country can say, well, on this issue we feel very strongly, we do not like the resolution, and therefore we will withhold our funding for the regular budget and also for all voluntary contributions, not just to UNESCO, but for the UN system overall. Legally, the position always has been, even if, for example, you are an elected non-permanent member of the Security Council and you vote against a resolution, but the resolution is adopted, you are still obligated to enforce that resolution in full. and that is the only basis on which collective decision making can work. So it does create some worrying precedents, and it raises some worrying questions for the future. At the same time, I think what it shows is that perhaps compared to 1945, when the United Nations was created, the sense of an international community united in values, combined interests of the collective overriding national interests separately, determined to forge a common destiny of prosperity and peace and stability underpinning world order, that this vision of an international community perhaps is beginning to fray and may well collapse if we are not careful. So I think all countries, but particularly the major powers who have the biggest stake in the United Nations as an anchor of the existing order, need to think through carefully the consequences and implications of their action, rather than be seen to withdraw in a huff because they do not like any one particular outcome, which results from the rules of the game that were essentially designed by them in the first place.